The story begins with a man named Paume, standing at the edge of a towering mountain, his comrades gathered behind him. As he gazed into the horizon, he announced that their enemies were approaching. In the distance, thousands of monsters advanced toward Paume and his comrades, ready to engage in battle. Among the advancing horde was the king of dragons, Gornthale, charging toward Paume and his comrades with relentless speed, ready to unleash devastation upon the remaining survivors. A woman stepped forward and spoke to Paume, informing him that the centaur's stronghold had fallen, leaving them with nothing else to rely on. The woman went on to say that the Cygna's Knight, the Resistance, the Cross Hunters, all the adventurers, and even the 6 heroes, once seen as the people's last hope, were now dead. She added that Paume was the only one left, the final adventurer who remained as their beacon of hope. As the King of Dragons drew near, Paume rallied his comrades, instilling courage in them. He urged them to fight for their lives, declaring this would be their final adventure. When midnight came, Paume was the only one still alive, though gravely wounded from the battle with the monsters. Paume surveyed his surroundings, realizing that everything had been destroyed in the battle against the monsters. As he gazed down, he saw his comrades lying lifeless on the ground, fallen in their struggle. On his knees, Paume found himself face to face with the severed head of the King of Dragons, Gornthale, which he had just cut off. Yet, despite this seeming victory, a sense of hopelessness overcame him. Looking up at the sky, he saw the dragon still flying above, alive and breathing, and at that moment, Paume knew it wasn't over yet. Paume then looked at the spot where he had severed the dragon's head and saw, to his dismay, that it was regenerating. In that moment, despair filled him. He had fought so hard, losing all of his comrades in the process, yet the dragon still lived. Paume muttered to himself that it had all been for nothing. Just then, the King of Dragons let out a deafening roar and launched itself straight at him. Seeing the dragon charging toward him, Paume closed his eyes, accepting that this was the end. He resigned himself to his fate, knowing there was nothing more he could do. As he braced for the inevitable, Paume thought that not only was their adventure coming to an end, but so too was the world. At that moment, Paume, fueled by anger, slammed his fist into the ground. His face twisted with fury as he resolved that this would not be the end for him. He refused to die in such a pathetic way. Memories of his fallen comrades, Philip, Jaden, Alexis, and many others, flooded his mind. Each of them had sacrificed their lives for the hope of victory over the monsters. With a roar of defiance, Paume swore he wouldn't accept this fate. This was not how he would let himself die. In that moment, Paume stood up, fury burning in his eyes, and shouted the dragon's name in rage. With every ounce of strength he had left, he gathered his remaining energy and prepared to unleash his magic for one final, decisive strike against the King of Dragons. Filled with renewed determination, he vowed that no matter what happened, he would not give up. But just as he was about to release his magic, blood poured from his mouth. His body had reached its limit, drained of energy, and he could no longer cast his spell. At that instant, the King of Dragons unleashed a massive surge of magical energy from its mouth, aimed directly at Paume. As the dragon's breath hurtled toward him, Paume wondered why it had to end this way. He thought to himself that if only he had been stronger, things might have turned out differently. His comrades might still be alive, and the world might have been saved. He thought that if given a second chance, he could change everything. Just as the dragon's breath struck him, he suddenly heard an angry voice shouting for him to get up. Jolted awake by a splash of cold water, Paume opened his eyes, confused by the sudden shift in his surroundings. One of the merchants, clearly irritated, scolded Paume for pretending to be sick while on the job, reminding him to remember his place as a slave. Paume, on the other hand, was stunned by the situation. He was astonished to find himself still alive, given his last memory of being killed by Gornthale, the King of Dragons. As he looked around, he was shocked to discover that he was in a completely different place. Observing his surroundings and the people around him, Paume realized he was in the slave market. Paume could hardly believe he was in a slave market, especially since he remembered that such markets had been abolished long ago. Yet, as he observed his surroundings again, it became clear that he was indeed in a slave market. When he turned his gaze to the merchant standing before him, he realized with shock that this was the same merchant who had overseen him 6 years earlier, when he was still a slave. At that moment, Paume understood with a jolt that he had somehow returned to the past. As he pondered the surreal situation, the merchant, growing impatient with Paume's inactivity and prolonged sitting, clenched his fist and delivered a sharp punch to him. Paume took the merchant's punch directly to the face but remained unmoved, his expression unwavering. He reflected to himself that, on that day, he had been brought back to the beginning of his story. Moments later, sitting on the floor with his nose bleeding, Paume considered the possibility that he might be dreaming, but he quickly dismissed the thought. The situation felt too real to be a mere dream. Unable to fully grasp the bizarre reality he was in, Paume realized there was no other explanation for his predicament. At that moment, a group of adventurers entered, accompanied by the merchant. The merchant explained that the slaves were intended to be used as bait for the adventurers, who could choose any of them they wanted. He added that the slaves were in good condition and had been recently acquired. Hearing this, one of the adventurers decided to take both of the slaves in front of him. Paume, feeling a surge of determination, resolved not to dwell on his current predicament. Recognizing this as his second chance at life, he was determined to make the most of it. A few moments before Paume was bought by the adventurers, outside the slave market lay the beautiful harbor city. As Raymond stepped off the ship, he shouted with excitement, thrilled to have arrived. His eyes sparkled with joy at finally being in Harbor City. Another adventurer, named Walker, approached from behind and asked Raymond if he was thrilled to have reached the city. Raymond, noticing Walker's own excitement, replied that Walker seemed just as happy as he was. At that moment, 2 more adventurers arrived from behind. One was a man named Turan, and the other a woman named Charlotte. Turan, catching the infectious excitement, exclaimed that he also wanted to take a break from their journey since they had finally reached Harbor City. He declared that this was where their adventure truly began. People lived in an era defined by adventurers who crafted their own quests and became heroes of their personal stories. During this time, mysterious gates had begun to appear worldwide, each leading to unknown realms filled with horrifying monsters unlike anything seen before. Countless adventurers had perished within the gates, but the unimaginably valuable and powerful items hidden inside continued to lure those with ambitious dreams. At that moment, Walker suggested that they needed bait to assist them when they ventured into the gates, which were teeming with monsters. Raymond, Turan, and Charlotte were puzzled by Walker's proposal. Walker elaborated, explaining that they couldn't plan effectively until they knew what awaited them inside the gates, as many adventurers had fallen due to unforeseen dangers. Therefore, Walker reasoned, they needed a slave as bait to help them navigate these dangerous situations. Charlotte then added that they needed someone to draw attention away from them while they made their escape. Agreeing with Walker, she endorsed the idea of using a slave as bait, calling it a sound plan. As they entered the slave market, a merchant greeted them and explained that the market was operated by the Gafor Merchant Union. He went on to say that all the slaves there were intended to be used as bait, so they could choose any slave they wanted. The merchant also assured them that the slaves were worth the price and recommended that they purchase from him. The merchant then pointed out 2 of the slaves, telling the adventurers that they were in excellent condition and had been acquired recently. Walker decided to take both slaves and informed the merchant of his choice. The merchant, pleased with the decision, agreed and, after completing the sale, wished them good luck on their adventures. Moments later, Walker, Raymond, Turan, Charlotte, and the 2 slaves, one of whom was Paume, stood before the gate. Walker approached the gate and informed everyone that he would mark the pillar to signal that they had entered. Noticing that no one else had ventured inside, he realized they would be the first to explore this gate. Walker then asked if everyone was ready, and they responded with excitement, confirming they were prepared. As they stepped through the gate, Raymond remarked that the experience felt unusual. Upon surveying their surroundings, he was astonished by the unique and mysterious environment that lay before them. As Raymond surveyed the surroundings, he commented that he had never encountered such a mysterious place before and that it was vastly different from what he had imagined. Walker reassured Raymond, advising him not to be overly nervous, and instructed everyone to move forward. He explained that gates were typically situated in areas distant from monsters, so they should have a brief reprieve from danger. Walker also added that they wouldn't be able to use the same gate to return, so they would need to find an alternative exit to reach their original starting point. Just as Walker was speaking, a monster appeared behind Charlotte and devoured her before she had a chance to react. The group was stunned that a monster had appeared so close to the gate, and within mere moments of their entry. Raymond screamed Charlotte's name, but it was too late, she had already been consumed. Panic spread among the adventurers, but Walker quickly took action. He activated his magic, drew his bow, and fired a volley of fire arrows at the monster that had just attacked Charlotte. At that moment, Walker realized something was seriously wrong. He instructed everyone to tie the slaves to the trees to use them as bait while they made their escape. One of the slaves pleaded to be taken along, but Turan told him to be quiet and follow orders. Meanwhile, Raymond closed his eyes, began running, and apologized to the slaves for leaving them behind. Holding Charlotte's lifeless body, Walker informed the others that the gate was too dangerous, and their mission was a failure, clearing it was impossible. He urged them to find an exit quickly. Meanwhile, Raymond, stunned and in disbelief at the events that had unfolded, was frozen with shock. Seeing Raymond's state, Turan grabbed him, shaking him awake. He instructed Raymond to pull himself together and listen to Walker. Turan reassured Raymond to calm down, acknowledging their failure at this gate but reminding him that they could always prepare for the next one. He urged Raymond not to give up and to focus on the present moment. As Turan reassured Raymond that they would all make it out of the gate alive, a massive monster emerged from behind and immediately crushed Turan to the ground, killing him instantly. Walker called out for Turan, but it was too late. Raymond, paralyzed by shock and disbelief, was at a loss for what to do. In a desperate move, Walker cursed the monster, drew his bow, and fired a barrage of fire arrows at it. However, the attack proved ineffective. The monster lashed out with its tongue, ensnaring Walker by the neck and pulling him toward it. Within moments, it bit down on Walker's head, killing him instantly. Seeing the horrific scene, Raymond fell into a state of panic, immobilized by fear. The monster then shifted its attention toward him, causing Raymond's terror to intensify. He began crawling backward in a desperate attempt to escape. However, the monster swiftly grabbed hold of his leg with its mouth. Raymond screamed in agony but continued to crawl, determined to flee from the beast. Meanwhile, a man standing some distance away watched Raymond being devoured with a cold, detached gaze. It was none other than Paume. Seeing Paume, Raymond called out for help, expressing relief that Paume was still alive. Bleeding heavily, Raymond confided that all his companions were dead, leaving only himself and Paume. He apologized to Paume for using him as bait and for abandoning him to die. Raymond, realizing he couldn't survive the gate alone, pleaded with Paume to help him, emphasizing that more people were needed to increase his chances of survival and escape. However, Paume remained unmoved, merely observing Raymond from a distance. Desperate, Raymond screamed and begged Paume to assist him instead of just watching him perish. Raymond cursed Paume for not helping him, but Paume merely gave a faint smile and told Raymond that it was too late to save him. As Raymond looked down and saw that half of his body was already consumed by the monster, he realized there was no chance of escape. Laughing bitterly, Raymond told Paume that he would not survive this gate and that Paume would be the monster's next prey. In that moment, Raymond was fully engulfed by the monster. After the monster had completely devoured Raymond, it turned its focus on Paume. Unbothered and calm, Paume took a fighting stance, ready to confront the beast. As the monster charged at him, Paume remained unfazed. With a swift, precise motion, he drove his spear through the monster's center, killing it instantly. Wiping the blood from his face, Paume vowed to himself that he would not die here and that this would not be the place where he met his end as in his previous life. A few moments later, Paume picked up a staff lying on the ground. Upon holding it, he discovered that the staff had the ability to produce fire arrows. Paume considered this newfound skill a valuable asset, noting that it was well suited to his current level of ability. However, he also recognized that having just one weapon was insufficient. Paume reminded himself that as an adventurer, he needed more than a single tool to face the dangers of the Mystic Gates, which were occupied with monsters. At that moment, Paume noticed a corpse of an adventurer lying in the Mystic Gates. Recalling that some adventurers hid their valuables in their shoes, he decided to check the deceased's footwear. From one of the shoes, he discovered a ring. When Paume put the ring on his finger, he was astonished to find it was a telekinesis ring. Suddenly, Paume's senses heightened as he heard a horde of monsters approaching from behind. He realized that the creatures might have been drawn to him by the scent of blood. In the heat of the battle, the monsters launched a fierce attack on Paume. He managed to defend himself initially, but one of the monsters struck a powerful blow, shattering his spear. Shocked by the strength of the monster, Paume realized the weapon was now useless. Just as the monster was about to deliver a fatal blow, Paume swiftly used his fire arrows to kill it. Determined to make use of his newfound telekinesis ring, he decided to test its power. Using telekinesis, he manipulated the fire arrows to target and strike all the remaining monsters in the vicinity. Although Paume managed to kill many of the monsters, he knew he couldn't keep fighting them indefinitely. While he was contemplating his situation, the staff that produced fire arrows suddenly went on cooldown. Noticing this, Paume relied on his brute strength, using the staff to fight off the remaining monsters. After a few moments, the staff's cooldown ended, allowing him to use the fire arrows once more. With renewed determination, Paume finished off the remaining monsters. As he surveyed the defeated creatures, he heard a voice behind him. As Paume turned to locate the source of the voice, he was surprised to see Charlotte, one of the adventurers who had bought him as bait, lying on the ground and near death. With her last breaths, she questioned Paume about his true identity, noting that he was no ordinary slave given his ability to wield both a spear and magic. Paume was taken aback to see her still alive, but before he could respond, Charlotte asked why he had Walker's staff. Glancing at his wrist, she noticed that he had awakened, and she wondered aloud how a mere slave could achieve such a feat. Charlotte, realizing the severity of the situation, accused Paume of being responsible for the deaths of her companions. She asked if he had orchestrated the entire tragedy. Before she could continue, Paume interrupted, clarifying that she had misunderstood. He explained that it wouldn't have mattered if he had planned their demise. Ultimately, he would have killed them all regardless, even if the monsters hadn't been involved. Shocked by Paume's revelation, Charlotte was taken aback. Paume, filled with disdain, declared his hatred for those who used slaves as mere bait. Without hesitation, he aimed the staff at her and delivered the final blow, ending her life. Moments later, back in the city, everyone was astonished that a mere bait slave was the only one who survived the gate and returned alive. Meanwhile, Paume reflected on his situation, realizing that the dice had already been cast. He knew he needed to act quickly to avoid repeating his past mistakes. As he glanced at the Adventurers Guild, he resolved that his first priority was to free himself from his life as a slave. Inside the Adventurers Guild, the guild leader, Abbas, was stunned to learn that Paume, the slave, was the only one who had returned alive. An executive informed Abbas that this was indeed the case. The executive added that, remarkably, Paume had returned without a single scratch. However, Abbas remarked that it wasn't surprising for someone designated as bait to come back unharmed. The executive then clarified that Paume was not only the sole survivor but that all the other adventurers who had accompanied him had perished in the dungeon. Upon hearing this, Abbas found it quite unusual. He noted that not only had Paume returned unharmed, but he had also come back on his own accord rather than fleeing. Abbas remarked that it was common for debt slaves to be used as bait again, even if they survived the gate. Despite this, he was astonished that Paume had not attempted to escape. This led Abbas to conclude that Paume must have been fully aware of the futility of trying to escape their control. The only way a slave could truly escape was through death, which was likely why Paume had chosen to return. He understood that escaping their hold was not an option. Abbas, after reflecting on the situation, told the executive that this was indeed the way of the Gafor Merchant Union. He questioned why the executive was reporting such a trivial matter. However, the executive interrupted Abbas, informing him of another significant detail: the slave had unlocked the first circle. Abbas was taken aback by the news that a mere slave had achieved this feat. He pondered the implications, realizing that a slave with such power could harbor resentment towards the merchant union. This new development raised concerns for Abbas, as he was uncertain about the potential consequences if things were to go awry. The executive then added that, In addition to everything else, the slave had requested a change in his contract. Abbas was perplexed and asked for clarification. The executive explained that the slave wished to register as an adventurer. Abbas was stunned by the audacity of a mere slave daring to alter his contract and seek to become an adventurer. To his further surprise, the executive informed him that Mr. Rakan had specifically ordered Abbas to personally handle the matter concerning Paume. Abbas stood in shock, taken aback by the unusual interest of a high-ranking executive in such a lowly slave. After a few moments, Abbas stood by the window, unable to believe that a mere bait, who was also a slave, wanted to become an adventurer. Paume recalled that in his own time, under Queen Signas, the status of a slave was supposed to have been abolished. However, this was merely superficial talk, as humanity had always been enslaved to Meso. The notion of slavery, perpetuated by the Maple world, dictated that those who failed to repay their debts would make amends through labor. This concept had become entrenched, despite the claims of progress. When Paume's only family, his father, collapsed due to illness, Paume was also thrust into slavery. He recalled the trial that led to his enslavement. Paume had purchased black moss from the Gafor Merchant Union on credit. However, the merchant union suddenly and drastically increased the price of the black moss to an amount that Paume could not afford to repay. As a result, he was accused of failing to settle the debt by the due date. Paume was then forced into labor for the merchant union, a form of exploitation that lasted for 6 long years. Paume was now in the guild master's room, resolute in his quest for revenge in this lifetime. He introduced himself to Abbas, noting that Abbas was a key ally of Rakan. Paume thought to himself that he had caught a significant target and planned to leverage Abbas to achieve his revenge. Abbas, sipping his tea, informed Paume that he had already reviewed the report and was aware of Paume's request to change his contract. He then told Paume he would be brief in his response. At that moment, Abbas told Paume that he was willing to revise the contract and offered to change it to one suited for an F-rank adventurer. Paume, pleased that Abbas was so quick to meet his request, thanked him but clarified that he wanted to be ranked as an E-rank adventurer, not F-rank. Paume thought to himself that he didn't want to be led by Abbas's pace. Abbas, surprised that Paume had rejected his offer and instead requested to be ranked as an E-rank adventurer, reminded him that the Adventurers Association hadn't even assigned him a rank yet. Paume then explained to Abbas that he had explored over 100 gates in the past 3 years as a baiting slave. Upon hearing this, Abbas replied that this still didn't justify Paume being ranked as an E-rank adventurer, pointing out that Paume had always served only as bait during those expeditions and had never actually captured a monster. At that moment, Paume asked Abbas since when had monster hunting become the defining virtue of an adventurer, leaving Abbas surprised by the question. Paume then elaborated, explaining that the reason the first adventurers made a name for themselves was through survival, not monster hunting. He clarified further, stating that the true virtue of an adventurer is returning alive. Paume felt confident in that moment that Abbas would accept his offer, believing that the information from someone who survived a gate was more valuable than individual accomplishments. Abbas admitted that Paume had a point and acknowledged that surviving as a bait slave for 3 years was no ordinary feat. However, he added that it was also Paume's only real achievement. Abbas went on to tell Paume that he had only entered dungeons with low difficulty rankings, and that his so-called survival skills wouldn't hold up in higher ranking gates. Abbas then accused Paume of taking him and the others for fools, thinking they would offer a risky contract to someone likely to die before even repaying the money. As Abbas looked at Paume, he thought to himself that Paume wouldn't get far with such overconfidence. However, in that moment, Abbas felt an unusual repulsion, as if Paume was different from the other slaves. After carefully considering, Abbas spoke up and told Paume about a gate where only 5 people could enter at a time, and it already had 12 scars, meaning the bones of at least 12 entire parties were buried there. Abbas then challenged Paume, telling him that if he was truly as valuable as he claimed, he had to prove it by entering the gate and making it back alive. Abbas added that if Paume survived and returned, he would do anything Paume asked of him. Moments later, Paume stood with a group of 4 adventurers. One of them introduced himself as Shev, the tank of the group. Shev mentioned that he had heard from Abbas that Paume was a baiting slave but reassured him, saying he didn't care about that and that Paume didn't need to worry. He added that his comrades felt the same as he gestured toward his team. Paume then responded, expressing his hope that they would work well together. Chev then mentioned that he had heard Paume could use fire magic, to which Paume confirmed it was true. One of the other adventurers stepped forward with a cocky attitude and said he'd heard that mages couldn't use magic or elements other than the one they were born with. He added that, apparently, any item unrelated to their element was useless to them, making things complicated. Chev then gathered everyone's attention, stating it was time to stop chatting. He explained to Paume that their mission wasn't to hunt monsters but to retrieve items left behind by the 12 parties that had been annihilated. Inside the gate, once they collected the items, they would return them to the Union. Chev added that the Union would reward them with 3,000 meso for each item they retrieved. Max, one of the adventurers, expressed his dissatisfaction with the price, saying it was too low. He argued that if they only retrieved a few items, they wouldn't gain anything significant, as items for First Circle adventurers were worth 7,000 meso or more. Therefore, the price they were being offered wouldn't even be half of the original value. Another adventurer named Tom interjected, telling Max to stop complaining. At that moment, Chev cut in, instructing them to stop talking and emphasizing that it was time to earn some money. Moments later, they all entered the gate. Max remarked that while the area was bright, it felt dreary. Chev then urged everyone to pay attention to their surroundings, noting that there was still a high chance of a long battle in the dense forest. He suggested they set up a base before that happened. Tom proposed that they establish their base in a tree, pointing out that the branches would make it easy to hide and move between them. Chev agreed, calling it a great idea, and decided they should proceed with that plan. At that moment, they took out all the tools needed to set up camp. Max approached Paume and assured him he could rest, as setting up camp was his specialty, while Tom worked on the setup. After a short while, they successfully finished building the base in the tree. Chev then announced that now that the base was ready, they would split into 2 groups to search the surrounding area. The group split up, with Tom, Max, and Roa assigned to Group 1, while Chev and Paume would form Group 2. Chev explained that they would each take the east and west sides to scout the area and then return to the base. He emphasized that if anything happened, they should send a signal and rush back to the base immediately. Chev then asked everyone if they understood, and they all confirmed they were clear on the plan. A few moments later, as they explored the gate, Chev was surprised that they hadn't encountered a single monster, let alone any items from the past adventurers. He told Paume that they would need to move further inside the next day. Changing the subject, Chev asked Paume how his first mission as an adventurer was going. Paume admitted that he was feeling nervous. Chev laughed when he heard that and told Paume it was the same for everyone. He explained that even after being an adventurer for a long time, he still felt nervous every time he stepped inside a gate. However, he added that despite the fear, he had the courage to enter because he had good people by his side. Chev acknowledged that it might sound awkward for him to praise them himself, but he wanted Paume to know that they were truly good companions. Chev then told Paume that he felt sorry when he heard about his past as a bait and a slave, admitting he couldn't imagine how difficult it must have been for him. Turning to Paume, Chev invited him to join his squad, if that was okay. However, just then, he noticed something on the ground. Paume quickly responded, asking Chev not to feel sorry for him. Night fell, and everyone sat around the fire. As they chatted about work, Chev suddenly interrupted, urging them to stop discussing it while they were eating, reminding them they could think about work the next day. Meanwhile, Paume quietly listened to their conversation. A short while later, as it was time to sleep, Chev, Max, Tom, and Roa approached Paume, asking if he was still awake. When they saw he wasn't responding, they burst into mischievous laughter. Max joked that Paume wouldn't be able to answer them because he was fast asleep. Max then remarked to Chev that he was being overly cautious since they had already mixed a sleeping herb into Paume's food. He confidently stated that Paume wouldn't wake up anytime soon because the herb was extremely powerful. Max added that Paume had consumed so much of it that it was a miracle he was still alive. He then mentioned that the fire arrow staff Paume was supposed to fetch would fetch them a good amount of money if they sold it. Excited by the thought, Max pulled out his dagger, intending to kill El Paume right then and there. As Max plunged his dagger toward El Paume, he felt nothing when he struck. Confused, he opened the cover, only to find it was empty, filled with rocks and wood shaped like a human body. Everyone gasped in shock, realizing that El Paume was nowhere to be found. At that moment, Chev instructed everyone to search for El Paume, insisting he couldn't have gotten far. Just as he spoke, a massive explosion erupted nearby, engulfing their base in flames. Panic spread as they realized their food supplies could also be lost in the fire. Chev then suggested that this might all be El Paume's doing, but before he could finish, Tom shouted in alarm, telling Chev to look at what was in front of them. As Chev looked up, he was shocked to see a massive monster staring right at them. In that moment, he realized that El Paume had set them up and used them as bait. Just then, the monster lunged at them with a powerful attack, but they managed to dodge just in time. From a distance, El Paume observed the scene and thought to himself that they shouldn't have been so kind to him if they intended to trick him. After all, in a gate where over 12 parties of veteran adventurers had failed, he couldn't believe they would so easily welcome a slave like him. El Paume concluded that it was clear the four were up to something sinister. El Paume studied the monster and realized it was the boss of that area. He suspected it might be that monster, given the broken remnants scattered on the ground, but he never expected it to be this massive. Meanwhile, the four adventurers were frantically running away from the creature, panicked and unsure of how to deal with it. Chev thought to himself that the monster they were facing posed a significant disadvantage. Tom then asked Chev what the creature was, and Chev replied that it was known as a gold slime, something not typically seen in gates. He further explained that the gold slime was a rare boss monster that only emerged from red gates. Its body was composed of acid, making it the worst possible matchup for a group that relied solely on melee weapons. Chev then added that the most dangerous aspect of the gold slime was its ability to launch long-range attacks. Just as he said this, the gold slime fired a magic spell called Acid Arrow at them. Luckily, they managed to dodge it, but the path affected by the attack was left corroded and burned, as the gold slime could shoot acid from its body. In a state of panic, Tom exclaimed that the monster was too powerful and expressed his uncertainty about how they would stand a chance against it. Tom asked Chev if there was any way to deal with the gold slime, but Chev urged everyone to get out of the area first. He explained that the acid arrow had a cooldown of 1 minute, giving them time to recover and formulate a strategy. Chev then informed them that they needed to break the core located in the gold slime's head to defeat it. Hearing that the monster's skill was still on cooldown, Max turned back, ready to attack. Chev saw Max preparing to attack and shouted for him to stop, insisting they should all strike the monster at the same time. Max argued that they still had enough time before the cooldown expired, claiming it was their chance to attack. Just as he said this, the gold slime shot another acid arrow, and it cut Max in half, killing him instantly. The rest of the group was stunned by the sight. While Chev felt a wave of confusion, he was certain there should have been plenty of time left before the monster's cooldown ended, yet it had used its skill again. At that moment, the gold slime shot another acid arrow, and all four of them disintegrated instantly under the monster's corrosive attack. El Paume realized the fight was over for them. He thought to himself that Chev had been right, but he also recognized that a gold slime could consume items to grow stronger with each one it ingested. This meant that the usual cooldown time of 1 minute had been reduced because the gold slime had become more powerful. El Paume noticed that the gold slime was abnormally large and that its cooldown was nearly non-existent. He understood, after observing the monster, why the other parties that had come to this gate had all failed and perished. It became clear to him that the gold slime had grown so powerful it could easily be classified as a creature suitable for a yellow gate, which was 2 levels above a red gate. El Paume realized that the gold slime was no longer a monster a first circle adventurer like him could handle. He acknowledged that the mission was now a failure, but then he recalled Abbas's words urging him to prove that he deserved to be an E-rank adventurer. In that moment, El Paume made the decision not to retreat. He resolved to confront the gold slime head-on. As the gold slime roamed around searching for its next prey, El Paume launched a sneak attack, using his fire arrow to strike at the monster's core. Unfortunately, the attack wasn't powerful enough, and the gold slime survived. El Paume, realizing this, thought to himself that the monster might possess magic resistance, as he was certain he had aimed directly at its core. Paume then thought to himself that if that was the case, 5 more shots at the monster's core might be enough to take it down. A smile crossed his face as determination surged within him. He was resolved to kill the monster and prove to Abyss that he was worthy of being an adventurer of a higher rank. At that moment, the gold slime began firing multiple acid arrows simultaneously. Despite the struggle, Paume managed to dodge the attacks. He reminded himself that he needed to hit the exact same spot as before without any mistakes. While he knew that no ordinary mage could execute such precision, Paume was no ordinary mage. In his previous life, he had been recognized as the best user of the telekinesis skill, enabling him to control his fire arrows with precision and strike the target exactly where he intended. In that moment, Paume fired his first, second, third, and fourth fire arrows with pinpoint precision, striking the exact same spot on the gold slime's core. Now it was time for him to unleash his final fire arrow for the killing blow. Just then, the monster launched a massive attack toward him, but Paume easily dodged it. Seizing the opportunity, he activated his fire arrow with a smile, confident in the outcome. He sent it flying toward the monster's core, and upon impact, the gold slime exploded, annihilating it in an instant. As the gold slime exploded, its acidic body splattered everywhere, but Paume skillfully dodged the fallout. Moments later, he observed that the entire area affected by the monster's body had eroded significantly. As he descended to inspect the scene, he spotted a tiny round red ball and quickly recognized it as the core of the gold slime. Without hesitation, Paume absorbed all the magical essence contained within the core into his body. Moments later, in the Adventurer Guild, Paume sat across from Abyss. Breaking the silence, Abyss remarked that Paume was not just a big talker, he had actually accomplished what Abyss had tasked him with. However, he then asked Paume why he had returned alone once again and noted that he didn't have the items he was supposed to retrieve from the gate as part of his mission. Paume then explained to Abyss that the adventurers assigned to team up with him were inexperienced and had ulterior motives, trying to steal the items he had worked hard to collect. To avoid them, he had chosen to separate from the group, only to encounter the boss monster, which ultimately led to their demise. When Abyss asked what kind of monster had killed his team, Paume replied that it was the gold slime. Abyss was taken aback and realized that if it was indeed the gold slime, all the equipment left in the gate would now be melted, devoured by the monster. Abyss, realizing the implications, felt a wave of annoyance wash over him. All the equipment rented by the Merchant Union to the adventurers was now destroyed, and there was no chance of recovering it due to the gold slime. This represented a significant loss for the Union. On top of that, Abyss had to deal with Paume, who had managed to survive and make it out of the gate, adding to his frustrations. There were a few common rules governing gates. First, the number of people allowed to enter was limited, only those marked on the gate could pass through, and once that number was reached, the gate would deactivate until everyone inside had been eliminated. Second, entrance was restricted based on the gate's difficulty level and the adventurer's circle levels. Gates were categorized by color, ranging from red to purple, and individuals with higher circle levels than the gate's difficulty could not enter. Thirdly, there was only one chance to raid each gate. This presented a significant obstacle for adventurers. If anyone who entered the gate survived and exited, the gate would be destroyed and could not be accessed again. As long as the adventurers who entered remained alive, there would be no additional opportunities to raid that gate. Abyss reflected on this, realizing that the gate Paume had entered was already a lost cause. Additionally, dealing with a gold slime was far beyond the capabilities of any adventurer, rendering the gate essentially useless. Abyss then told Paume that even though he had managed to survive and the items had all melted, his failure to retrieve them due to the gold slime did not change the fact that he had not completed the gate and had ultimately failed to conquer it. Just as Abyss was speaking, Paume interrupted, asking him to be patient, as he had not yet finished his explanation. At that moment, Paume removed his leather armor from his arm, and Abyss was shocked to see that he now bore a second circle mark. With a confident smile, Paume informed Abyss that he had consumed the core of the gold slime he had defeated. Abyss was taken aback by this revelation. Paume then asserted that this achievement was more than enough to prove his qualifications, insisting that Abbas fulfill his promise to promote him to an E-rank adventurer. Abbas, filled with excitement, announced to Paume that he was not only going to promote him but that Paume would now be elevated to a D-rank adventurer. Paume was taken aback by this unexpected news. Abbas continued, enthusiastically assuring Paume that if they worked together, he would treat him as if he were a C-rank adventurer. In that moment, Paume took the contract and signed it, sealing his new fate. Abbas, observing Paume, reflected that promoting someone who wasn't even a third circle mage to C rank would usually be seen as excessive. Adventurer ranks were heavily influenced by mage's circle, which signified their power, and the differences were stark. However, Abbas recognized that Paume was anything but ordinary. The rapid advancement from a first circle mage to a second circle in such a short time was unprecedented. Abbas thought to himself that he had never encountered anyone like Paume before and realized that he needed to recruit him for future endeavors. Paume realized that his treatment had improved faster than he anticipated, but he chose not to dwell on it. His focus shifted to the significant event approaching in the next few days, the opening of the Red Rank's first 100-member gate raid. This major event was garnering attention from both the Lithport Merchant Union and various guilds, and Paume suspected that the Gafor merchant was also quite interested. Considering the urgency of his own plans, Paume thought it might be a perfect opportunity to advance his goals while the excitement around the event was building. Paume then asked Abbas for a favor, prompting Abbas to inquire about what he needed. When Paume requested a loan, Abbas was taken aback and annoyed that he would dare to ask for money. After a moment, Abbas moved to the window, watching Paume as he considered his next steps. Though Paume received the funds, it wasn't quite enough for his needs. Still, he reassured himself that it would be a good starting point for his plans. Paume considered that the newly discovered 100-member gate was a red level gate, accessible only to those of at least 2 circles. Typically, the Gafor Merchant Union focused on selecting high-ranked adventurers, but they were willing to invest in a second circle mage like Paume because they had their sights set on this gate. Although he had secured some money, he knew it would be unwise to spend it all on items that suited his level, as those would be prohibitively expensive. Instead, Paume thought it might be more strategic to consider purchasing a slave at the slave market, as that could provide him with valuable assistance. As Paume contemplated his options, he arrived at the Lith slave market. A merchant greeted him warmly and inquired about the type of companion he was seeking, asking whether he needed someone for dungeon bait or a warrior to fight alongside him. Paume replied that he already had someone in mind and asked the merchant to simply lead the way. The merchant, puzzled by Paume's response, nonetheless guided him through the market until they reached the punishment ward. The merchant explained to Paume that they had arrived at the punishment ward, a place designated for disciplining slaves who misbehaved, exactly the type of individual Paume seemed to be looking for. With a hint of nervousness, the merchant asked Paume once more if he truly wanted the slave before him. Paume affirmed confidently that this was indeed the person he had been searching for. Before Paume's return, a significant event unfolded, the death of a person named Aaron, known as the Polearm Hero, which accelerated the end of the world. In her final moments, Aaron had one last disciple, Debo, infamous for being the hero killer. When Paume approached him, Debo coldly informed him that he didn't need to be there, insisting that he didn't know Paume and dismissively told him to leave. The merchant, upon hearing this, apologized for Debo's rude behavior. However, Paume reflected that while Debo's demeanor might have changed since his return, he was now merely a slave. Paume found it offensive that adventurers like Debo were being treated as nothing more than slaves, which he did not approve of. The merchant then mentioned that no one was as reckless as Debo. Paume reflected that, like himself, Debo was one of the few who gained attention after the world's last day of destruction. Paume recalled that he and Debo had often been compared to each other. They were from the same region, had awakened around the same time, and possessed similar skills. But what truly connected them was their shared dire need for money at that moment. Paume then asked Debo directly how much he was worth. Debo, after studying Paume, remarked that he looked like a young master from a wealthy family. Without hesitation, Debo declared his worth as 1 million meso and asked if that amount was acceptable to El Paume. At that moment, El Paume recalled that Debo had a younger sister who, unfortunately, suffered from black blood disease. While El Paume was lost in thought, Debo grew irritated and told him to leave if he didn't have the money. But just then, El Paume reached into his bag, pulled out a stack of bills totaling 1 million meso, and showed it to Debo. Both Debo and the merchant were stunned at the sight of the money. The merchant immediately asked El Paume if he was really willing to pay 1 million meso for Debo, while Debo, still in disbelief, questioned whether the money was real or counterfeit. El Paume then asked them to hold on and told Debo to listen carefully. He explained that the contract terms would last for 1 year, with the dungeon profits being split 70-30 in El Paume's favor. El Paume added that he would have the first pick of any items that dropped from the gate. At that moment, the merchant realized that El Paume was proposing a partnership with Debo as an equal party member, not as a slave. El Paume then handed the contract to Debo, telling him to review it. Debo immediately grabbed the contract and warned El Paume that there would be no turning back once it was signed. As he reviewed the terms, Debo realized that what El Paume was offering was an incredible deal, far better than what most slaves could hope for. Usually, slaves wouldn't receive any share of the loot from the gates they entered with their buyers. Understanding the significance of the offer, Debo bit his thumb and signed the contract with his blood. El Paume, observing this, thought to himself that Debo had accepted without hesitation because his sister's life depended on it. Debo needed money urgently to save her. El Paume then gave a small smile and told Debo that since the contract was sealed, they would head straight to the gate immediately. Debo, full of enthusiasm, assured El Paume to leave everything to him. El Paume's expression then turned serious, and he told Debo that he needed to prove his worth. In response, Debo, smiling confidently, promised El Paume that he would work harder than anyone El Paume had ever seen. Moments later, as the two made their way to the gate, Debo, still a bit confused, expressed his gratitude to El Paume for buying him a new weapon. However, he mentioned that he usually fought with a longsword, and right now, he was holding an axe. Debo suggested that they return to the shop to exchange the weapon for one he was more accustomed to using. El Paume looked at Debo and told him that from now on, he would be using a polearm when working with him. If Debo didn't like it, El Paume added, they could end the contract right then and there. With no other choice, Debo reluctantly agreed to use the polearm. As they stood in front of a gate, Debo asked if this was the gate where El Paume intended to test his skills. The gate was a red-level gate with an entry limit of 8 adventurers. Noticing this, Debo looked around and asked where the rest of the party members were. He then remarked that someone with El Paume's wealth surely had a strong team of adventurers ready. Debo then asked if there was a healer in their party, but El Paume simply stared at him, expressionless. Confused, Debo asked why El Paume was looking at him that way. El Paume calmly assured Debo not to worry, saying they had enough party members. Relieved, Debo sighed and admitted that El Paume had scared him for a moment. But as he spoke, El Paume pointed directly at him and declared that Debo was the only party member he needed to enter the gate. Debo was stunned by this revelation. At that moment, El Paume kicked Debo inside the gate and urged him not to waste any more time. Debo, however, was screaming in disbelief at the situation he found himself in. Once inside the gate, he turned to El Paume, anger boiling over, and exclaimed that it was crazy to attempt an 8-person gate with only the 2 of them. He insisted that there should be a limit to El Paume's recklessness and added that he shouldn't treat a life or death situation as a joke. Debo then pointed out that, on top of everything, he had to wield a weapon he wasn't familiar with at all. In response, El Paume looked at Debo with evident annoyance. Just then, as Debo continued to voice his complaints, a horde of monsters known as stumps charged at El Paume and Debo, drawn by Debo's earlier screams. These stump monsters were notorious for their tough bark, which swords and spears struggled to pierce, and now a large number of them were advancing toward the two. El Paume quickly stepped in front of Debo and instructed him to move aside. He then unleashed a fire arrow, incinerating the approaching stump monsters in a blaze of flames. After defeating the monsters, El Paume expressed his disappointment, saying he hadn't expected Debo to act so cowardly right after they entered the gate. He warned Debo not to make the same mistake twice. Meanwhile, Debo was stunned by El Paume's ability to dispatch all the monsters with a single strike and thought to himself that El Paume was truly a monster in his own right. In a different location outside the gate, a woman informed a mysterious man that the merchants had taken the bait. She added that they were still working on the plan but had already selected the individuals they would be sending. The woman then asked the mysterious man if they had permission to proceed with the plan. At that moment, holding up a cup of wine, the man replied that he would achieve freedom in this world. Back with El Paume and Debo, they had finished dispatching all the monsters in the vicinity. Debo then reported that he had collected a total of 27 magic stones from the defeated creatures. Upon hearing this, El Paume suggested they continue moving forward, and Debo readily agreed. As they walked, Debo reflected that he had initially thought El Paume was just a crazy person, but after witnessing his fighting skills, he realized El Paume was no joke, he was the real deal. Debo observed El Paume using his telekinesis, manipulating fire arrows with remarkable precision, and he thought to himself that he had never seen anyone control telekinesis in such a way before. Debo then smiled to himself, thinking that working with a talented person like El Paume would allow him to earn a lot of money. With the profit split at 70-30, he realized he could save on medical and living expenses for his little sister. While Debo was lost in these thoughts, El Paume suddenly interrupted him, saying they had found what they were looking for. Confused, Debo turned to see another group of stump monsters, numbering around 9, in front of them. Upon hearing El Paume's comment, Debo was puzzled by what he meant by a perfect number. El Paume then looked at Debo seriously, as if urging him to figure it out. Moments later, Debo found himself fighting the monsters alone, just as El Paume had instructed. As he battled the creatures, Debo couldn't help but think how annoying it was to face these monsters with a weapon he was unfamiliar with, making it difficult to hold his own. He wished he had 10 lives, imagining how much easier the fight would be if he did. Observing from a distance, El Paume thought to himself that Debo had mentioned he had only ever used a sword as his main weapon, which made his awkward movements all the more evident. However, El Paume believed that Debo would soon come to realize that the polearm he was wielding would be the key to unlocking his true potential. He had no doubt about Debo's talent, especially since he was the only one chosen by the polearm hero to be her student. As Debo fought the monsters, he began to realize that the polearm he was wielding had a significant range and impressive power. In fact, it felt more comfortable than the sword he was used to. He noticed that after he relaxed and stopped tensing up, the polearm felt lighter in his hands. By wielding it more gently, he discovered that he could easily slash through the monsters, making it simple for him to take them on alone. El Paume, observing Debo's progress, thought to himself that Debo had quickly gotten the hang of the polearm. Despite not having awakened a circle yet, Debo was already showing remarkable skill. Suddenly, the ground shook violently, and Debo screamed in surprise, initially believing it was an earthquake. Just then, a massive monster burst through one of the nearby rocks and lunged at Debo, but he managed to dodge the attack just in time. He was taken aback by the sheer size of the creature. As the monster prepared to deliver a powerful blow, El Paume rushed in to save Debo, guiding him to a safer position. Once there, El Paume swiftly threw Debo to the side to protect him from the impending attack. El Paume then spoke to Debo, explaining that the monster's size had no bearing on its threat level. In fact, larger creatures were often easier to defeat. With that, he launched a fire arrow directly at the monster, but to his surprise, the creature managed to block the attack. Realizing the monster's speed was greater than he had anticipated, El Paume decided to alter his approach. He shot another fire arrow, this time using telekinesis to guide it with precision. As he maneuvered the arrow to strike from behind the monster, he was taken aback when the creature still managed to block the attack. El Paume was shocked to witness this unexpected display of agility. El Paume and Debo began to sprint away from the monstrous threat. It soon became clear to El Paume that magic was ineffective against the creature. He noted that it wasn't that his attacks were failing, rather, the monster was simply adept at blocking every one of them. Upon further reflection, El Paume realized that the branches protruding from the monster were interfering with his spells. Just then, the monster launched a powerful attack toward them. Fortunately, Paume quickly employed his telekinesis, allowing him to maneuver both himself and Debo out of the dangerous situation. Debo exclaimed to Paume that he thought he was going to die. However, Paume quickly interrupted him, instructing Debo to focus on the stump monsters while he handled the larger creature. Debo was shocked to realize that several stump monsters were already charging toward them, ready to attack. As Paume moved to confront the giant monster, Debo attempted to stop him, but Paume was too fast. Without hesitation, Paume summoned another fire arrow and unleashed it at the enormous creature. Seeing Paume's attack, Debo thought to himself that it was futile. Defeating such a monster required a proper plan, and they needed to find a way to escape. However, as the fire arrow exploded, it surprisingly inflicted damage on the creature. Debo was taken aback, realizing that Paume had managed to hurt the monster after all. At that moment, Paume realized he understood how to effectively combat the monsters. He concluded that he just needed to shoot fire arrows and use telekinesis to maneuver them around the branches that protected the creatures. Although the branches were quick to block his attacks, Paume knew he had an advantage. As a second circle mage, he could conjure magic twice. This ability allowed him to create 2 fire arrows simultaneously, increasing his chances of success against the monster. Debo watched in astonishment as Paume conjured 2 fire arrows simultaneously. Not only that, but Paume had also devised a clever strategy to take on the monsters. One arrow would serve as a distraction while the other approached from behind. Debo realized that even if the monster managed to block the first arrow, it would be unable to defend against 2 consecutive attacks. As the monster struggled to counter Paume's tactics, Debo couldn't help but think that Paume was even more formidable than he had initially imagined. At that moment, several stump monsters managed to slip past Debo and positioned themselves behind Paume, preparing to attack. Debo, noticing the danger, shouted a warning to Paume. However, Paume remained calm, using his telekinesis to direct his fire arrows and swiftly eliminate all the monsters that had approached from behind. Turning toward Debo, Paume expressed his disappointment, telling him that he expected Debo to handle the smaller monsters on his own, leaving Paume to assist only when necessary. At that moment, the massive monster launched a powerful attack toward Paume, but he skillfully dodged it. Paume reminded himself that he couldn't let his guard down against such a formidable foe. Just then, Debo rushed in front of Paume, swinging his pole arm and delivering a hefty blow to the monster. Turning to Paume, Debo exclaimed that he had just saved him and demanded that Paume retract his earlier criticism. Paume smiled at Debo, activating the power of his staff, and remarked that Debo finally seemed to be proving his worth. With newfound determination, Paume declared that it was time for them to finish off the monster, and Debo wholeheartedly agreed. In that moment, Paume summoned 2 fire arrows, aiming them directly at the monster's branches to clear a path for Debo. With the obstruction gone, Debo swung his pole arm and delivered a powerful blow to the creature. Paume instructed Debo to attack the monster from the left while he would strike from the right, and Debo nodded in agreement. As they launched their coordinated assault, they unleashed a flurry of attacks, successfully severing multiple branches of the monster. However, just then, the monster retaliated, delivering a heavy blow toward Debo. As Debo was about to be thrown into the creature's maw, Paume quickly used his telekinesis to pull Debo to safety, preventing disaster. At that moment, Paume realized that the situation was becoming increasingly troublesome. Meanwhile, Debo felt overwhelmed, believing he wouldn't be able to escape the monster's relentless attacks. Shouting at Debo to finish the monster, Paume urged him to act decisively. Seizing the moment, Debo swung his pole arm with all his might, delivering a powerful strike to one of the monster's eyes, completely destroying it and leaving the creature partially blind. As he landed back on the ground, Debo declared that he wasn't finished yet. With renewed determination, he launched himself at the monster again. Paume, using his telekinesis, retrieved the pole arm lodged in the monster's eye and sent it back into Debo's waiting hands. With perfect timing, Debo executed another fierce attack, injuring the monster severely. The monster, however, still clung to life. In a decisive moment, Paume fired 2 of his fire arrows directly into the creature's mouth, incinerating it to death. After the threat was eliminated, Paume approached Debo, who was nursing his injuries, and praised him for his excellent performance. Debo, in turn, complimented Paume, and they stood together, watching as the monster was reduced to a charred husk. Moments later, as night fell inside a cozy house, a little girl glanced at the clock and realized it was getting late. She was about to eat her dinner and reminded herself to eat quickly so she could go to bed. Just as she began to pray, she heard a knock on the door. Curious, she opened it and was taken aback to see her older brother, Debo, standing there, bruised and covered in blood. With a smile despite his condition, Debo greeted her, saying he was back. Overwhelmed with emotion, his sister couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She burst into tears and immediately hugged her brother tightly, relieved to see him. In a desolate area, a solitary house stood, belonging to Paume. Upon arriving home, Paume was met with a heart-wrenching sight. His father lay lifeless, having been left unattended since Paume was taken as a slave at a young age. Staring at his father's still form, Paume remained silent, a storm of emotions brewing within him. With a heavy heart, he activated his fire magic, igniting flames that consumed both his father's body and their home. Once the inferno was underway, Paume turned away, leaving behind the remnants of his past. The following day, Abbas sat in his office, deep in thought, realizing he faced a significant challenge with the upcoming 100-man gate. He was uncertain about how to organize the event effectively, especially with Sir Rakan overseeing things this time. Abbas knew that any failure on his part could lead to serious repercussions. He considered that all 10 major merchant unions would be intensely focused on clearing the gate. Abbas acknowledged that securing an epic or higher tier item was almost guaranteed in a 100-man gate, with the possibility of even obtaining a legendary item if luck was on their side. However, he also recognized that, given the number of guilds participating in this venture, the likelihood of acquiring a legendary item for themselves was slim. Among the guilds participating, the 3 Natasha sisters from the Golden Merchant Union stood out as formidable contenders. Their power was so impressive that it was hard to believe they were merely second circle adventurers. Even the second circle adventurers from the Gafor Merchant Union paled in comparison. When considering the overall talent pool, not just from the Goldrich Merchant Union but from all 10 major merchant unions, it was clear that the adventurers being sent were the cream of the crop. Abbas was acutely aware that his Gafor Merchant Union was significantly outclassed by these elite adventurers. Just then, a knock echoed from Abbas's door. As he called out to ask who dared to disturb him, Sir Rakan entered, catching Abbas by surprise. He immediately greeted Rakan with respect. Sir Rakan took a seat in Abbas's chair and inquired whether Abbas had prepared the list of parties that would be participating in the 100-man gate from their side. Abbas, feeling flustered, apologized, admitting that he had not yet organized it properly. Rakan, taken aback, expressed his surprise at Abbas's oversight, noting that it was unlike him to fall behind on his responsibilities. Rakan then turned to Abbas and asked what he thought about Paume, the new recruit. Abbas replied that while Paume showed considerable talent, there were several factors to consider. He pointed out that, although they recognized Paume's skills, they couldn't overlook the incident when Shev's entire party had been wiped out. That incident made Abbas particularly skeptical. Upon hearing this, Rakan suggested that they should put Paume to the test once again. He mentioned that there happened to be a suitable location to assess Paume's abilities. Rakan advised Abbas to gather all the parties he had considered for participation in the 100-man gate. With a smile, he added that this time there would be many witnesses to determine whether Paume was truly as talented as they believed. A few moments later, Paume and Debo were en route to a different gate, ready to conquer new challenges. However, they weren't going alone, other adventurers would accompany them. Debo, noticing the number of adventurers, felt a surge of happiness and remarked to Paume that they would have plenty of company inside the gate. Just then, one of the adventurers approached them and asked if they were the 5th party. The man then looked at them with disdain and sneered, remarking that they were merely 2 individuals with a slave background. Paume, observing the other adventurers' unfriendly gazes, realized that they would not be welcoming toward him and Debo, given their recent history as slaves. Paume glanced at the adventurers and noticed that, although they weren't vocalizing their thoughts, their disdainful stares communicated a clear message. They believed that slaves like him and Debo would only hinder the other adventurers. Paume acknowledged that it was typical for experienced parties to harbor such views. As he examined the group more closely, he realized that all the adventurers were either first or second circle mages. He thought to himself that these adventurers were vastly different from Chev's party. They were the real deal and didn't require any bait to tackle the challenges posed by the gate. Abbas stepped forward and addressed the gathered adventurers, stating that now that everyone was present, he would keep his remarks brief. He announced that they would proceed with the test and that he would offer a chance for those who demonstrated their abilities. Confusion spread among the crowd regarding what Abbas meant by that chance. He clarified that successful completion of the test he had arranged would grant them the opportunity to participate in clearing the 100-man gate. Gasps of surprise rippled through the group at the prospect of such a valuable opportunity. Abbas continued, mentioning that he was prepared to offer special treatment, urging everyone to give their best effort in clearing the gate they were about to enter. Meanwhile, Paume reflected on Abbas's intentions, knowing precisely what the man was aiming to achieve. The adventurers entered the gate, finding themselves in a dense forest. One of the adventurers suggested that they should only gather together when it was time to confront the gate's boss. In the meantime, he proposed that they split up to explore the area, with the plan to regroup when they received a signal. Another adventurer chimed in, declaring that his team would simply eliminate anything in their path and urged everyone to stop wasting time and begin their exploration of the gate. His teammates nodded in agreement, ready to follow his lead. As they walked deeper into the forest, they encountered a single monster. The leader of the group, spotting the creature, announced that it was just one monster and immediately launched a magical attack. When the spell hit, he remarked that it was boring because the monster was too weak. He then ordered one of his subordinates to retrieve the magic stone from the defeated monster so they could move on quickly. However, as the smoke cleared, they were all shocked to see that the monster was still standing, unharmed. The leader was taken aback that his magic had failed to subdue it. Just as he was about to voice his confusion to the team, they suddenly realized they had been surrounded by numerous other monsters, and panic set in as they understood they were in serious trouble. A few moments later, despite the intense battle, they managed to defeat the monsters, though everyone was left feeling exhausted. One adventurer called out to their leader, Dolan, expressing concern that the monsters were stronger than usual and asking what they should do next. After carefully considering the situation, Dolan informed his team that winning based on kill count was no longer feasible. If they continued at this pace, they would exhaust their stamina before achieving anything significant. Dolan then proposed a risky but decisive strategy. They would break away from their alliance and head straight for the boss. This way, they could secure a victory more efficiently. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.